Welcome to C.S. Lewis, Lessons from C.S. Lewis, Part 2. I would like to continue by telling you that C.S. Lewis is really noted for his Chronicles of Narnia. However, he always thought, by studying his letters, that his real fame would come from evangelism. That's what attracted me to C.S. Lewis. And so let me read you one of the excerpts from his letters. This is from July 9th, 1939. You'll be both grieved and amused to hear that out of about 60 reviews of Out of the Silent Planet, only 2 showed any knowledge that my idea of the fall of the Bent One was anything but an invention of my own. But if there was only someone with a richer talent and more leisure, I think that this great ignorance might be a help to the evangelization of England. Any amount of theology can now be smuggled into people's minds under the cover of romance without their knowing it. So here he means by romance, fantasy, science fiction. He was believing that his evangelism would be carried on mostly through his scientific science fiction work. And so C.S. Lewis always intrigued me because once you start studying C.S. Lewis, you start off with fairy tales, you start off with wonderful characters in fantasy, but then you get into deeper knowledge, or what Aslan calls the deep magic, the spiritual knowledge that we all need to acquire. And so I was interested in C.S. Lewis because my pastor kept on quoting C.S. Lewis from the pulpit. And as he did that, I wondered, why is he doing that? This man is an Anglican. He's not from my denomination. And so I started looking up this research and found out that C.S. Lewis is one of the most quoted pastors in terms of pastoral ministry. He is used by pastors as illustrations. And so I started looking up in Time magazine. They honored him as the most popular Christian with Americans in 1974. He was on the cover of Time magazine. And so when I started really doing more serious research on C.S. Lewis, I found that this was what we call a multi-dimensional Renaissance man. He had many, many talents in apologetics, in discipleship, in evangelism, in terms of his ethical stands, in terms of his literary ability, his terms of criticism. And so I thought that this was really amazing. And I started getting surprised by this. Nonetheless, I picked up a book called Surprised by Joy. And then I picked up another book called A Grief Observed. And in these 2 books, I think these are his 2 autobiographical books to really read because he is understanding the aspects of even what we call joy in Christ conquering death, joy in the suffering that we have to have. And so as I went through and started studying all the works of C.S. Lewis, I started understanding that this would be a great, great way to look at my own life. I've been searching for joy, but I was putting myself first, not J-O-Y. Jesus first, others, then yourself. And so I thought that C.S. Lewis would be an amazing person to look at. So I looked at his first book that he ever got published, and believe it or not, it was a little fairy tale called Boxen. Boxen was a fairy tale that grew out of his work with his brother Warnie when they were playing with little characters in their fantasy minds in the garden. And so some of these characters show up later in the Chronicles of Narnia. And then I went into another idea of his search for fantasy and mythology, and ultimately his creativity and his scholarship in studying Norse mythology, Celtic mythology, Greek mythology. And so he was very, very versed in these areas. But what is important about that is that that is what made him understand that Christianity was the true truth, the true myth, the myth that a culture believes in that was based not on fantasy or legend, but upon truth. And so he understands that ultimately. And then he again sees himself as a literary writer and delves into poetry. He writes a long epic poem called Dimer, which is kind of a dark poem because it's when he goes through his depressing childhood, when he has to move out of his beloved Belfast in Ireland. And so he has to move to England. And as this starts happening and he starts going to grammar school, he meets a headmaster that gives him a knock in the head for being a bad student. And so he calls him the hard knock. And so this hard knock, Kirkpatrick, his headmaster, was a profound atheist. But you know what? In his letters, C.S. Lewis says, this is the person I learned the most from in all my career, because he set him off to understand how he has to challenge his ideas. In the world of ideas of thinking, he has to understand how to engage someone with opposite beliefs. And so this is how he learned apologetics and philosophy to counter these arguments in mere Christianity. And then I went into his other books on, again, the search for his joy, and found those books that I mentioned, The Grief Observed, and all these other books that he wrote were preparing him for this whole idea of what it means to be a Christian. When he writes Mere Christianity, which is noted as one of his classical works, he does not basically have a true personal relationship with Christ yet, in my opinion. In fact, this is what my book is about. It's about how he had to grow from his intellectual, rational, reluctant convert into one who has a personal relationship. And it's only after the death of his wife, Joy Davidman, that happens. So we'll look at her life next, because I think that's a good place to start, because we have to influence others with our evangelism. So I'll see you next time as we talk about his relationship with Joy Davidman.